Hello everyone, thank you for coming. My name's Alex Chapman and...
I'm Anna Higgs.
Obviously not James Kay. Changed to the original plan, James wasn't able to make it. And that has impacted on the talk panel in a couple of ways. One is James won't be able to do his presentation and I'm not really going to do his either. So what we're going to do, we're going to stick to the same kind of script. We're still going to go through the three principles of exploring business and legal landscape of transmedia and looking at the ways of maximising the effectiveness of transmedia, and also hopefully look at things like new business models and new ways of, new and good ways of approaching it. But I'm going to do some of the business and legal stuff, and Anna is going to talk from a much more practical point of view as being someone who's on the front line. So hopefully that dynamic will work out, and if it doesn't, you'll be sure to let us know, no doubt. So let me just give you a bit of, we'll start with just a little bit of introduction into who each of us are. My name's Alex Chapman. I'm I suppose an IP lawyer originally, but I'm an interactive entertainment lawyer with a particular emphasis on commercial and IP issues. My main clients include games developers and online, I suppose, interactive agencies, online businesses, amongst others. I got into this by being a games developer when I was a kid, or at least I helped my brother make games. He did all the coding, and I made him cups of tea and gave him ideas, so I suppose that makes me a games producer. And since then, I went through law school, helped him set up his business, and subsequently have helped lots of other companies set up their businesses. And more recently, done a lot of work in cross-platform, and for the purpose of this exercise, we've been using the word transmedia to describe what we do. Do you want to...
Yep, my name's Anna Higgs. I am co-founder and producer at Quark Films. We are a company that tells stories, be they drama, fiction, animation, or a mixture of all of the above, for TV, theatrical, and digital platforms. My background is a digital media consultant and producer. I did big corporate work for the likes of Accenture on interactive design, how to engage your customers online, and various fun things, and then moved through into more of the media creative side of things, going back to my heart, where I started in the kind of arts world. So throughout, it's always been about telling stories, and normally in quite... Thank you. I like coffee as well. That was part of my introduction. Always telling stories, but really trying to be as innovative as possible. So that's always quite interesting when you're trying to somewhat, for want of a better cliche, change the game. You come up against lots of interesting rights and money issues. So hopefully I can shed some light using some specific projects that we've done to talk about our experience.
Thanks, Anna. One of the great things about being able to change the talk is that it allows us to adapt it to what we've seen over the last couple of days. And I don't know how many of you were at the Crossover Summit yesterday, but that and some of the things we've seen, particularly in this room today, have been really interesting and allow us to kind of springboard off the back of that, particularly in the sense that we've seen a lot of talks over the last few days about people doing amazing things with interactive, documentary makers using online and interactive platforms to be able to do things that they couldn't otherwise have done. And as we saw with Lucy Cook yesterday, anybody who hasn't seen Lucy Cook's sloth video absolutely has to see it. I don't know where it is, but just YouTube, Lucy Cook's sloth video, and you'll see it. And that's enabled her to go off and do what she really wanted to do, which was make films and documentaries and TV shows. Now, whilst transmedia isn't just about interactivity, a transmedia project that involves a graphic novel and a linear film and some advertising billboards is just as much a transmedia project as a project that involves film, game, social networks, websites, and all those kind of things. It is useful to, I think, to wrap up kind of wrap up the interactivity element in Transmedia, in the title Transmedia for the purposes of this exercise, and also because what we've tended to be seeing is that certainly in the documentary world, you see the truest forms of transmedia. A lot of people use the word transmedia very loosely, and a lot of people hate the term transmedia. I'm not a massive fan of it. I use it because it's a good shorthand. It's not something that I'm particularly passionate about in terms of a term. But what it does in the documentary world is go to the true heart of what the transmedia means, and that is the telling of a story across various different platforms, where each platform enhances or advances the story and the narrative of the story in a different way. Now that's really important, I think, in terms of a talk about transmedia, because it's not Harry Potter, the book, the film, the merchandise, everything that goes around that. What it is taking a story and allowing that story to be told in different media, but actually where the different platforms, the different media, do something different. And with documentaries, we see that much more than I think almost on any other platform, because a documentary, you can't have necessarily, well, I suppose you could have a book of a documentary, but it's difficult to have a game of a documentary, because what are you going to do? If you take, for example, the Ayrton Senna film, well, you can play as a racing driver and try and chart that, but it's a true thing, it's a factual thing. What good interactivity in this area does is it provides a new way of engaging with the audience and spreading the message. And the reason that that's important in this context is that the current landscape, business and legal landscape, is that whenever you are engaging in a transmedia project, you are dealing with different people. For a documentary maker, or somebody who has a story to tell and would choose a documentary or that kind of linear format, what transmedia does, and interactivity does, means that you have to talk to different people. And when you talk to different people, you are talking to different people in different industries and talking a different language. And we've also heard a kind of a common theme from a lot of talks, that the pace at which the business and legal process runs within broadcasters is much too slow compared to what the digital companies need and how it runs there. And I think that what that also shows is there's a difference in language, but there are tensions and there are difficulties at those meeting points. And the current legal landscape is such, and business landscape is such, that is creating inefficiency and causing things to be lost. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about a theory I have that when we go to the next part of that. But I think what's really important to understand is that I'm not going to be able to, and we're not going to be able to give necessary answers of how a transmedia deal should be done in terms of this is the wording that should be used or any of the kind of legal nitty-gritty, and I don't think you'd want us to. But it's a way of thinking about these things and how we deal with the fact that there are different people talking different languages. And that the key is to make sure is to recognise that and understand that. And certainly Anna and I had a conversation on that before this, and I think Anna's got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me as a producer sort of sitting in the middle, I'm creating stuff, but I'm also asking financiers to give me money to create that stuff. I think particularly I would echo the business and legal affairs side of things is is kind of catching up, but catching up slowly, because the rate of change for all of us is so rapid. It's really hard to keep track with how things are changing. But we are now dealing with new sectors that do work in very, very different ways. It happens to be my old sector, the kind of digital brand corporate world. But what is interesting is in film, arguably film, publishing, music, all largely work in the same sort of ways. And so when you're suddenly talking to a digital agency whose timescale's a lot shorter, who's used to a very rapid turnaround, or a brand who wants much more immediate results, but it's all tied into a very large broadcaster project that's going to take me months to sign off, you hit some really interesting barriers. And as a small company, we hit particular barriers where you can't cash flow that work, that even though you know it's coming from, say, a Channel 4. Even Keo Films this morning were talking about how long it took to do the fish fight deal, and so how much work they had to do themselves before they could really get it underway, because there are always timelines. I think the other side of the coin that's really interesting, and that we might talk more about when we use a project example of mine, which is a feature documentary, The People versus George Lucas, is fair use. I think there's some really interesting things about both protecting your rights but also sharing and being open about rights. There's some really interesting grey, gnarly territory springing up, some of which we trod around in using Lucas's footage from the films that he doesn't want anyone to see. So that was quite interesting. Tried it first time with one of the biggest filmmakers in the entire world, but can happily talk about that and use specifics on how we did some of it.
Thanks. The principle behind all of this is that people who are doing this have a story to tell. And documentary film is a fairly kind of, well, I was going to say limited, that might be unfair, but it is a linear platform. There is no scope necessary for interactivity in a true film documentary. And it's all about storytelling, and documentaries have been the way that some people have decided to tell that story. But there are other ways. Transmedia allows us to do that, and what happens in all of these cases is you have an idea, you start with an idea, and the key is to get the idea to the consumer. And documentary makers use film to get the idea to the consumer. Games developers use games to make the consumer get the idea. Writers write books. You can go on. Songwriters write songs. It's all about getting the idea to the consumer. Now, at each point in the process, the chain that takes it from idea to consumer, there are things that happen. Now, if you look at the IP side of things, there is no IP, no intellectual property, no copyright, no intellectual property, no copyright in an idea per se. Ideas are protected by intellectual property rights to the extent that they are expressed. There is only copyright in the expression of an idea, not the idea itself. When you express that idea, other rights arise. And when you develop it through to the consumer point and you make it available to the consumer, and a variety of intellectual property rights arise. It can be trademarks and rights in the brands, copyright in the case of a film, in the script, in the music, in the film recording, and the sometimes in the set design and things like that, or the sets, copyright in the logos. There's all sorts of rights there. In games, there's copyright in the underlying software. There's copyright in the visual appearance and the graphics. There's copyright in the music. There's copyright in the audio. And when you then bring film and interactive digital games together, there is this great tension in the fact that in film, you have a movie, a film, and you have the tapestry of rights that goes around that. In games, you have the visual thing that you see, but you have a lot more that's under the bonnet. You have software and code that is used by successful developers in all of their games, or a lot of their games. And it staggers a lot of people to realise that a wrestling game actually uses the same engine as a motor racing game, which also uses the same engine as a first-person shooter game, which can also use the same engine as a very simple puzzle game. It is the same underlying code. And when you start talking about interactivity and interactive and games to filmmakers and people who are doing other things, understanding the fact that under no circumstances will those developers let those rights go, creates a huge, or can create a really significant dilemma for the people commissioning the work, because in the world of film and broadcast, they're so used to owning everything. Now that's changing, but a good example is about 6 years ago, one of the first projects of this type that I was involved in was a TV show called Time Commanders. I don't know if anybody saw it. It only had 2 seasons, so it kind of had can't be that many people. But that was based on some technology that was used in a game called Rome Total War. I don't know if any of you have played that. But it was a very accurate historical strategy simulation where you took the role of a Roman general and reenacted various battles. Now, the great thing about it, from a TV company's point of view, was the fact that whenever they wanted to make TV shows based on battles and reenact battles, before, what they would do is they would get a whole load of men, generally, sorry ladies, but I'm not being sexist, it would be men, dressed up in costumes and with wooden swords, and they would go out into a field and then pretend to have a fight. And that was, well, it looked rubbish, but not only that, it was very, very difficult to get usable content, because if ever you wanted to refilm a particular scene or a sequence, you would have to tell everybody to stop, put them all back into position, and start again. Now, two production companies, saw the potential of using this games technology to solve that problem. One was the History Channel, who did Decisive Battles, and that was with Paradigm Productions, David Frost's company. The other was Lion Television, who decided to use the same thing to do effectively a game show. And both were great deals, both relationships were very good, but one of the things that inevitably affected it was the fact that this was a game that had millions and millions of pounds spent on it. It was going to be released by Activision, one of the biggest games publishers in the world, and it was expected to sell 1 million, 2 million units. The games company was never going to let the TV company have any rights in the underlying code or the technology or the game, because that game was going to be retailed for about £40 or £30. So having that discussion about what rights the broadcaster and the production company could have had certain tensions. Now, as soon as they realised that all they needed, all they wanted, all they actually cared about was the actual footage that the game produced, then the solution was obvious. They would own the rights or have the rights in the footage that was produced and that they needed. We would take everything else. Now, I mention that because it shows that there's a very simple solution to some of these problems. That is that let the developer keep all of the rights that the developer needs in order to be a games developer. You take the rights that you need in order to be the company that you want to be, or to produce the production that you want, and everybody's happy. Now, I appreciate it's not always that simple, but it shows that in this world, in where these two converge, it's actually not a difficult language that we're speaking. There's not a difficult balance to achieve. And throughout the whole chain of rights and chain of business dealings, there is always that solution to be found. And so I'm going to let Anna talk a bit about her project. But I'm also going to come on into a kind of a wider, slightly Professor Brian Cox-esque way of looking at this in the next instalment.
I'm looking forward to that. I'm not sure. Are you going to go up a mountain and be filmed by a helicopter? I'm
going to perform and bring the Labour Party to power as D-Ream.
Great. So we produced a feature documentary that was released, it had its world premiere last year at South by Southwest, called The People versus George Lucas. Very rapidly, it kind of does exactly what it says on the tin, but it's exploring the love-hate relationship of Star Wars fans with the creator of the franchise that they have come to love, and then, because of the new trilogy, come to hate. I, as a result, have learnt way more than I would ever need to know about Star Wars. I've even got a Star Wars t-shirt. But basically, we approached this film from several different points, and I think from a rights and money point of view, first and foremost, I'm a creative producer and I want to make a really good project. I want to tell a story in a very strong way. And we realised straight away that with this idea, not yet expressed, therefore not copyrightable, we had an opportunity to make something quite different. A linear film wouldn't tell this story well. A director going out, making his own choices and telling the story as he saw it would be one person's view of this argument, essentially. So we suddenly thought, there's an audience out there, a very large audience of Star Wars fans. There's probably a good majority of you in here secretly. And basically, why don't we use the technology and the tools that are available right now and that this audience are probably very into, not wanting to be stereotypical about sci-fi fans, but, gaming, online, social media, let's use those to tell the story in a bigger, better way, and actually in a much more democratic way. So we did an open call to fans, foes, filmmakers and friends around the world to send us their thoughts. Do you love or hate Lucas? What are your opinions? What do you want to tell us even? We really threw the doors wide open. And when the kind of floodgates opened. Within 24 hours of the first call on our website, we had something uploaded from Australia. By the end of the 9 months call, we had over 700 hours of footage sent to us from virtually every corner of the world, including an Arctic research station. But as somebody said yesterday, they probably haven't got very much to do anyway. So there was a rights implication straight away. It was our idea. The film called The People versus George Lucas, the minute we put it on our website and said this is what the film is, that's our idea, that's our right. Straight away, we also talked very closely. We let Lucasfilm know what we were doing. We were saying we wanted to make an open and balanced documentary, started communication lines with people that we knew we would come and meet again later on in the process. I think that's very important. But then there's the rights in the stuff we're asking for, or we're being sent, we're essentially being given. We were very transparent. It's my full belief that if you're going to interact with people, it has to be two-way. If you're asking for something, you've got to give something back. But we were also honest about the fact that as essentially self-funded filmmakers on this project, we would not be able to pay people for their content. Therefore, we recognised that in the rights we were asking for. We simply asked people to sign a very easy, one-page, basically deal memo that said, you have the right to give us this is your creation, and we have the right to use it non-exclusively. Because it would be pretty out of order if we said, only we can use this thing that you've made for us with love and care and attention. One person sent us 7 hours of a webcam rant, literally 7 whole hours of him talking to his webcam about every film Lucas has ever made. I haven't watched all of it. Another person sent us a 1-minute stop-motion animation that took them a year to make for us. It was just absolutely astonishing, the kind of range of stuff and effort that went into it. So obviously, we have non-exclusive right then to use these thousands of filmmakers' work. We also obviously had to reserve the right not to include it in the film because we couldn't fit 700 hours into a film. So then we carry on. The other half of the film is made up of us filming expert witness testimony, so people that were made the Star Wars films, know Lucas, etc. The next part of the film comes when we need to use examples of what the debate centres on. So if you're a real Star Wars nerd, stuff like did Han shoot first, which is when there was, in the re-released digital editions of Star Wars, major piece of the plot, according to fanboys, got changed, and Han Solo didn't shoot Greedo first, and so that changed the character. It's real betrayal, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the only way we could really do this is by showing the clip of the original film, which now, by the way, doesn't exist. That's one of the kind of really bigger political filmmaking issues discussed in what seems quite a light-hearted film to start with. That then involves asking Lucasfilm if we can use their footage, or in a normal rights world it would. Because essentially we made this film under guidance of best practices in fair use law, which is much more accepted and much more in practice in the United States. This film is a UK-US co-production and has very interestingly, and I think slightly worryingly, just been talked about by PACT that they're not accepting fair use as a policy over here. They don't want to deal with it. They think it's good that it should be opposed broadly. But there's a report coming on that. With the help of the Centre for Social Media, who are a really interesting set of guys working with digital rights in the US, look them up, Google, we went about best practices in fair use to acquire, i.e. rip from Laserdiscs, the only existing copies of the original films, I kid you not, the selected bits of footage that we needed, and it's a really rigorous process. Don't think in exactly the same way as rip a remix manifesto or steal this film did. It's a really easy thing. You just pull whatever clip you want and put it up into your project. We had to cut things by a single frame to ensure it was properly journalistically making a point, not overusing somebody else's copyrighted footage. It is not copyright theft. It is a valid debate point. So that was really interesting. We had to go through thousands and thousands of legal reviews. So it's not an easy process, but a really worthwhile one in the end, and one that we had to deliver to our errors and omissions insurers in huge folders that kind of filled a room. Because what's interesting, then this film was made in, I think, quite an innovative way. It's got cutting-edge fair use stuff in it. It was made with the help of its audience, so we've got an audience already. And we then wanted to get it out there, obviously, as broadly as possible, but hopefully in a really innovative way too. Then you hit the next sort of set of rights, that we own the film. We have delivered even the stuff that's somebody else's copyright in a fair use way, therefore it's kind of pretty solid, it can be bought. But what we wanted to do in our wildest dreams was let then the audience start playing with the film to their own view. If they want to see more about Jar Jar Binks, they can see more about Jar Jar Binks. If they don't want to see him at all because they want to deny his existence, they can recut the film themselves. That's when we came up against a really interesting set of decisions around whether we wanted a traditional theatrical release and we wanted to go out there. And in essence, by this point, it was a hard decision. We did. We wanted to be in cinemas. The director very much wanted to see 3 years of his work up on big screens. And so we went through a traditional sales agency and distributor model. What that then means, though, is we can't do that recutting stuff in quite the same way or with the same freedom that we would. It does mean that I can pay my mortgage, hopefully, one day. But essentially, because if you were to do that, there is an entirely new film and an entirely new copyrightable project, and therefore it would need to be insured again and go through legal review again, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We came up against, copyright laws 100 years old in this country. We came up against things that meant we can't yet. I mean, still something that I'm very much working on in terms of trying to do episode 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, merchandise, I don't know. I want a toy of myself. But essentially, it was very interesting that we had to close down some of our aspirations for innovation because we also had the aspiration of crazy stuff like feeding ourselves and having a house. But the rights world is catching up, particularly the US in terms of fair use, and that side of things is catching up. What we have managed to do is use digital platforms to get the audience to interact, tell us where they are. We're using a tool called Crowd Controls, which means they can demand a screening in their town. They can even host screenings, become their own cinema, do some really interesting stuff on that sense. But overall, I think there are decisions to be made by producers and filmmakers in partnerships with rights owners and with your financiers on where you are pushing envelopes and where you are willing to give things away for free, where you are willing to share stuff. We've put much more footage of the film on our website than an average film would do, because a lot of it's made by the people, that gave us all that stuff. But where you are willing to push the boundaries of that decision between it really truly being open and honest and faithful to the platforms that help you make the project, and also still trying to get a return on your investment and get the film out there. Is that useful? I hope so. No, not yet, because again, that in a traditional distributors model is, what are you doing? Because that's 5,000 people who will actually buy the movie. What we have done, though, everybody is fully credited in the film. Everyone has been alerted to the fact that they are featured in the film. And at some point, when we have what the director wants to do is a kind of specially narrated version that he then sends out to everyone. So we'll do something special for those people, yeah. Okay. So the question, I think everyone heard, but the how we manage the relationships between different parties on that, it was long and it was arduous. We did a lot of the work ourselves in terms of the logging of material, particularly all the fair use stuff, because if we would have got lawyers to do that, I probably wouldn't have been able to afford to get the train to Sheffield. No offence.
No, I would have done it for free, of course.
Obviously. What we often did actually is we used the Centre for Social Media as a first checkpoint. They were really, really useful in terms of saying, okay, so would you look at a draft, etc. So that what we were doing is giving final, we were pretty secure it was ready for a final authority or legal review. Also, though, because it is so cutting edge, our lawyer, one of our US lawyers who was working pro bono on this, because he wanted to get into this world and it's really fascinating, was often talking to them for advice because he'd never dealt with something like this. Not many filmmakers decide to take on George Lucas, and because he's pretty guarded about his copyright theft. He's suing the guy who invented the Stormtrooper outfit, even.
Not just him.
And not just him, lots and lots of people. He's suing a lot of people. But legal fees, therefore, were actually pretty astonishingly minimal. But in terms of time, there were two of the production team pretty much full-time for about 4 months doing the deliverables. And E&O took a really long time, but in actually a very good way, because we ended up getting no exclusions. Does everyone know what E&O is? Does anyone want an explanation of E&O? Yes? E&O is errors and omissions insurance. It's required by distributors and often TV broadcasters. Basically, that if someone goes, what the heck, that's mine, the people who are screening it don't get sued. You get insurance, essentially. But you have huge deductibles and all the usual stuff, just like house insurance.
It's a great job for lawyers because you get to watch the film and charge for it.
Yeah.
Sorry, I mean, not very much.
But, I mean, we surprised a lot of people when we got E&O on this film. It was quite interesting. If we hadn't have got E&O, we would have gone a different way. It would have been our choice to take the punt on whether we would whether we would start taking the film out there or not. And when we got our E&O certificate 2 days before the South by Southwest premiere, we all slept a bit better. Well, all the producers slept a bit better. The director wasn't that bothered. No, it was a really interesting process. It wouldn't be something I would want to do at that scale or without a proper budget to support next time, I have to say. But I think it's just like self-distributors say. Yep.
This whole thing about people kind of cutting or producing their own version of something is happening quite a lot now. You know, the band called the Kaiser Chiefs have recently put 20 tracks online and you can download 10 you want or something. Now, I wouldn't be interested to know whether they had similar issues that you did, or perhaps whether, in your case, it was just that having hoodwinked George Lucas by your Laserdisc trick, he was very pissed off and got all the lawyers he could throw at it to find some way of pissing you off.
No, Lucas has never threatened us with any legal action whatsoever. He declined to be interviewed for the film when we asked him. Well, because the problem exists in essentially the film that we showed at South by Southwest, the 92 minutes and 33 seconds or whatever it is the thing, the single linear thing that is insured by our E&O insurance and is the People versus George Lucas, 1.0 essentially. If you then change that, that is not covered by anything else. It would change because fair use essentially is so strict. It's really brilliant, but it's very, very strict that if you change the context in which the clip is shown, it might change from fair use to not fair use, therefore could be copyright infringement. So it's like remixing a song. You've got to get the rights for the use of it, and you might have Kaiser Chiefs own all the rights in their music, their own music, I presume. And I would assume on that website where you're remixing their music, as a user, you agree to the terms and conditions that you are giving your IP for free. Whatever your remix is, they can do what they want with, because it's a fun endeavour. Ours was distinctly tied up in the fair use issue. So, it's not something to be taken lightly. And it only worked out for us because we did it from day one. A lot of filmmakers have come to me and asked questions about it afterwards. And they've gone, we've put this and this in the film. And it'll be fine, won't it, at the last minute. And you've got to show due diligence. You've got to show that you followed a good process, which I think is fair enough. It's somebody's work and it's somebody else's property. I just think there's a really interesting... that doesn't mean I can't talk about it, I guess, is my point, as long as I do it in the right way.
It's a really fascinating talk, and given that this is a talk about rights and money in transmedia, it's a brilliant example of using rights and the flow of rights and money in transmedia, because one thing that's particularly interesting is the fact that it's third-party rights. Normally these conversations are about what rights you have, how you protect those rights, etc., 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 who owns what. This is a great example of how using different platforms has enabled something to come together that wouldn't otherwise have been able to happen. And that's essentially what I like to think kind of cross-platform, or if you like, transmedia does. Because a lot of what we're talking about here, and a lot of what we look at when we look at transmedia is why are you doing it in this way? Why are you having an interactive component? Is it just because at DocFest everyone was talking about digital? Is it because the internet's really big and lots of people are on the internet, and actually I've got an iPhone and I can play apps on my iPhone now, so therefore I should be able to do something? Or is it because it actually advances the story and helps you achieve what you want to achieve? I mentioned Lucy Cook earlier. She went to South America, for those who don't know, and she'd been trying to get a documentary together, funded, dealing with the plight of amphibians and reptiles, frogs, essentially, in South America, and that they're them being endangered species. But she wasn't having a great deal of success. She funded herself going to South America, set up a blog, tweeted about it, did lots of stuff, set up a Facebook page, got some followers, did reasonably well, okay. Then she posted a video of a whole load of very sleepy baby sloths in a sloth sanctuary in Chile, I think it was. And in a course of about 3 or 4 days, that had gone viral and gone global. And all of a sudden, it had just, taken the world by storm. Stephen Fry tweeted about it. Lots of people were tweeting about it. And she's ended up with a TV deal with National Geographic, going around the world, reporting or filming about ugly endangered animals. Now, for her, the use of online interactivity, other platforms, enabled her to achieve something she couldn't otherwise have done. Similarly with Anna's project. And when we look at the legal and business issues associated with this, it's all about idea to consumer. How do I get my idea, my story, my point of view over to a consumer? Now, that means dealing with the flow of the idea through the various different participants to the consumer. In the case of Anna's project, the participants were the general public. And how did she address those issues? In a very clever and simple way, have certain terms and conditions, presumably, that applied to the contributions that they make. I'm working on a game project at the moment where a lot of people are going to be contributing to the development of a game, a new AAA game. It's a big legal undertaking, but it'll be worth it. And it also shows that in terms of the money side, there are different business models out there to enable you to do what you want to do. It is, to a certain extent, giving part of your content away for free, like Lucy Cook did with the video. It ends up building loyalty, building community, and it's the community and the loyalty that has the value in the longer term. Because, as you'll have probably seen from internet business startups are generally all about building internet real estate, owning a place on the web, owning a space that isn't necessarily protected by copyright or any other rights. It's just the fact that you've got that space, that community, that has a value. And so, as Anna said, when they decided to do the People versus George Lucas film, they owned that internet space because no one else was doing it. And that meant people would contribute to it. They owned that community and so on. And so the flow of rights there is interesting. The flow of money there is interesting. As in, there is no flow of money at the start. The money comes later. And dealing with that flow of rights and money is the key to this. Now, the Brian Cox element that I was going to come on to is that you do have this flow of rights and money, and it's all swimming around in this sea or the gap in the space between getting the idea to the consumer. And I, at South by Southwest, did a talk where I compared it to the laws of thermodynamics. So the first law of thermodynamics says that energy isn't created, it's just converted from one form to another. The second law of thermodynamics says that in any energy conversion there is entropy, there is inefficiency, some energy is lost. And if you think of a transaction, generally it's more, it works in the transmedia context, but it actually works to any transaction where you are dealing with creativity and and ideas and trying to get them to the consumer. An example of the law of thermodynamics in practice is a car and petrol. In the ground, there are big pockets of oil. They have huge amounts of what's called chemical potential energy. But you've got to get to them, you've got to process that, and you've got to convert it into something that is in a consumable form. That takes effort. Then, once you've got it into a consumable form and you put it in the car has to burn it to make the engine go. And you have all sorts of energy loss around that. Heat, friction causes loss, sound, and you end up with generally quite an inefficient use of the energy. Now, if you take ideas and creative business, ideas are the energy of creative business. If you imagine you've got an idea, that's like a big pocket of oil in your head that needs to be got out. There is no point having that idea if you can't express it, or at least from a point of view of getting the story out there. And when you express it, that creates inefficiency. That causes entropy. And the more people that are involved in that process of converting your idea into something that's consumable, getting it to the consumer, the more that is potentially lost. Now, by the same token, people can also add energy to the process, but other people can also suck energy out of a process. And so when you are doing deals with other people, the key is to minimize entropy, maximize the efficiency of the transaction. And the key is to get the idea from the idea to the consumer in the most efficient way, without losing anything. But also what Transmedia does is allows you to not only throw energy in at other points, but it allows you to recycle some of the lost energy. If you've lost some of the energy, if you take the analogy of a car, that energy that would otherwise be lost as heat can be fed back into the car and can heat the car up. That energy, the exhaust fumes that would have heat, actually a turbocharger will feed them back into the engine and can make it more powerful. And that's what Transmedia can do to a certain extent. Because if you feel that in your documentary, your film, you're going to be losing certain types of certain audience members, or you're not going to be engaging with them, then the interactivity, the games component, is a way of bringing them back into the story and getting them engaged with the story. In the world of film as well, it's a way of re-engaging people who might otherwise have been lost. It's a way of introducing new concepts and new people to the story that otherwise might have gone. Now, I mentioned that because in the business of transmedia, and in the world of looking at kind of the new models and new ways of looking at the business process, those things are why you would do transmedia. They are why you would look to have different platforms and different levels of interactivity, move the story in different directions.
I think that's really interesting. Paula in the session earlier said something quite interesting about why am I doing these cross-platform elements around a film. Somebody asked a question about what can a game do for a documentary, and there was quite an interesting discussion around that. And there was a question around, are you trying to make a film or are you trying to express an idea? And if it's the latter, you are probably looking at an interesting transmedia project. I think in terms of rights and money, you can add a layer on top of that and ask the question, what is my actual goal? What do I want to do? Am I doing the transmedia elements to draw more of an audience to one project? Am I, for example, with... you could argue that People versus George included people not to make it a democratic film, but actually just to build a core audience right from the start. I would say that isn't true because, you have a core audience of Star Wars fans anyway. Something like Hugh's fish fight, the big fish fight on Channel 4, was actually the core idea was a campaign, was making a change, and all of the different elements did different quite successful ways of pushing forward that central goal. Because I think if you think about your project in that way, you can analyse all those different elements, you can analyse all those places where you could be losing energy and what energy could be coming back in. And it can help you ask the questions of what you should be giving away and what you should be retaining in terms of your rights and in terms of potential transactional value, i.e. money. We had a really interesting discussion with a major broadcaster, dual language, works all around the globe. You probably know who I mean, but I'm still in negotiations, so I can't say. With a documentary that now broadcasters in particular are getting much more aware of the value of digital rights to their platforms because they can brand your content as their platform. It's the same kind of argument between BBC iPlayer shows up before you see it's BBC Two or BBC Four, etc., when you're looking at that platform. So our film would show on this broadcaster's website as well as their channel. They wanted rights to the film, obviously to show for a certain number of transmissions over a certain number of years. They wanted simultaneous streaming rights, so the same time it was on their broadcast digital channel, it would also show on their website, and they wanted VOD. And in their case, it didn't mean a lovelily geo-blocked iPlayer or 4OD, it meant their YouTube channel. And for me, there comes a discussion of, okay, well, what's my central goal with this film? This film happens to be about a young Afghan refugee at Calais trying to get into England and examining the kind of responsibilities of documentary filmmakers. And really interestingly, we had to have a debate as a team around, well, actually our core goal here is expressing the importance of this issue, and therefore showing that as broadly as possible should be the most paramount thing to us. However, if we allow all of those rights to go, that means we can't get the film to go on a broadcast channel on a traditional medium in any country, because no other broadcaster will buy that because it's on YouTube. So what do? Do I hope that I'll get more sales, and therefore, because, for me, there is a particular audience on YouTube. I want an unparticular audience to watch it on their local, whether it's SBS in Australia, whether it's Arte in France. I would like that to go more widely than just be on one particular platform. So we ended up negotiating around the rights. First of all, we were actually told there is no negotiation, it's all or nothing. We then found it wasn't. And what we've ended up agreeing is that they will have the rights, all the broadcast rights they want, but only simultaneous streaming. They won't have the YouTube channel. It will remain to be seen if I've made the right decision, and if the filmmakers have made the right decision, because we are now relying on our own ability to then sell it to other platforms and to other broadcasters so it can be seen, it may well have got out to a far wider audience on that channel's YouTube platform. But we decided that, and not for a money reason, we wanted it to be out further. And actually, that was something that was a decision towards the end when the film was made and it's getting out there. But I now want to start integrating that thinking into making and coming up with ideas as that conversion of an idea into something else. It's where will this live? Where will it be useful to live? And if it's actually going to make more of a difference by being free online, what am I doing in the package of rights, in the development of ideas that will help me pay for having made this, for example? Is it that I have a paid-for learning tools app that people can download, or a subscription to updates? Where is my revenue going to come from if I'm giving away my core kind of very traditional media rights of the film itself? If that's what my goal is, if I want to balance rights and money. And I think it's something that feels distinctly uncreative, but I think can actually be quite powerful in the development of ideas, because it essentially can help you get your idea out there more. But also, as a small production company, I need to make sure that we're returning investment to develop the next idea and the next idea. And so it's always a toss-up, and I think each project is completely different.
I think the phrase I've used is charity for the story, charity for the film. It's if you think of it as what you do is charity for the project, it's hugely powerful. And in actual fact, for a lot of projects, the biggest IP right that you have is the right to prevent what's called passing off or trademark infringement. It's the brand. And you protect that with goodwill. And so any kind of charity that you can give that will generate a community, that will generate a following, can actually be the most valuable IP right that's creation, or the most valuable asset that you end up creating. In so many deals you see, people are prepared to not make a great deal of money from Project A because they know that the community that they will build through it, if it's successful, will drive everything else. Facebook's business has become what it is, and Groupon's business has become what it is, multi-billion, because they have a community, and it's the community that has the value. Now, within this, and within the world of transmedia projects, interactive projects, whatever, what is very important is to identify where those rights are, or manage the intellectual property rights. And because they are the assets of the business, they are where the value essentially sits. And I've come up with an acronym, IPEE, IP, which is a helpful way of of understanding the management of intellectual property. And IP stands for Identify, Protect, Enforce, Exploit. And that is kind of your four-step process, or three-step, because enforce and exploit kind of go together. But in any project which has rights, and that's a transmedia project especially, the first thing you need to do if you want to maximise the value, and that doesn't have to be necessarily a financial value in terms of money flowing through, but certainly, if you're thinking about money, it could be an end value, asset value, is you need to identify what rights you have. You need to identify what components of the project there are, and identify what rights there are in them. Now, as I mentioned before, in a film you have copyright in the script. In a video game you have copyright. Film script, you have the film, you have the music, you have all sorts of other things. You have the brand. In a game, you have the underlying code as well. Now, in Anna's project, you have those things, plus you have rights in the fact that you've obtained a license to use all of the content that you would want to use. That's a valuable asset. The next stage is to look at protecting those rights. And from a practical point of view, that means having agreements with the contributors that allow you to use those rights, and that would include the terms and conditions between you and the consumer or the person contributing, and that would be the contract through the terms and conditions. That would mean trademark protection, trademark registration. It means just making sure your contracts are properly in place, that you use the right copyright notices, that you use confidentiality agreements in the right circumstances. In software, you might want to look at things like patents in the US, because you don't have patent rights in the UK or Europe in software per se. It means rights in the community, the database of contributors. And then the next stage is to look at how you enforce and exploit those rights, because you need to enforce your rights, otherwise you lose them. There's a principle of acquiescence or laches in as it's known in the States, where if you don't use your rights, you effectively lose them, or you're deemed to acquiesce. And similarly with exploitation, that you need to be exploited in order to generate the value. And I just wanted to kind of deal with that as because we're coming towards the end, as a kind of a takeaway for you to say, well, in rights, money, transmedia, that is the most, I suppose, the most important point in terms of dealing with the value. At each junction point, whenever you are dealing with the various different contributors and participants in a transmedia project, whether it's the software developer building the interactive element, whether it's the film director or the cameraman or the musician, the audio guys, at each point, at each junction point, there is a rights conversation to be had. And as I mentioned before, it could be that rights conversation can be solved by saying, well, you only need that, so you take that, I need this, so I'm going to keep that. It could be, as Anna said, looking to not worry so much about certain rights, because you just want to get the message out there. But there's a conversation to be had, and in each conversation you identify and protect those rights, and you address that. And then the other part of it is the exploitation enforcement. Around that, there are other aspects. For example, the fact that if you're going to give or get exclusivity, then there is a quid pro quo for that, and that is going to be, if you give exclusivity, then you need to be damn sure that they're going to use what you provide, and that it's not just going to sit on a shelf, and so you want some kind of guarantees. But essentially, having that conversation and identifying the rights and looking the ways that they're going to be exploited and enforced is I think a fairly useful takeaway for you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer any more questions if there are ones about either specific projects or kind of if people have particular queries on projects they're doing. That you've got a lawyer in the room, use free advice. That's what I do.
Did you have any broadcasters involved from the beginning on your project?
On People versus George? Yeah. No. We actually purposely made it with a kind of combination of a small amount of equity finance and deferrals. Well, partly because that's how the filmmaker wanted to work. He wanted freedom to make it in his time and with his view. We also did a fairly kind of detailed financial analysis and took the punt that this was such a commercial idea, we could ask a lot more for it when it was finished. It's just about coming good at the moment, so fingers crossed. But that's a difficult decision to make. It might have been actually very interesting, although actually I think it might have been very scary. I can't picture going into, we've worked with Channel 4, BBC and international broadcasters and saying, yes, so we're using like 1977 Star Wars, we've ripped it off a Laserdisc, that's fine, isn't it? I could see various business affairs execs passing out at the suggestion. So you get a freedom, but you also have a limitation in terms of your power. I know that talking to certain contributors and saying we are working with X channel, if I could quote a good brand that we were working with, would give other people confidence. So it's a double-edged sword, and we decided to make our bed that way.
Were there any contributors that you didn't get because you didn't have an identifiable broadcaster?
I don't think we lost any contributors because we didn't have an identifiable broadcaster. I know, not think, that we didn't get some contributors because they didn't want to piss George off. The title of the film, The People versus George Lucas, sounds pretty antagonistic, even though actually the film itself isn't. It's an interesting thing, but the sort of, we couldn't really change it because the whole idea was it was a kind of courtroom-style examination with evidence for the prosecution and the defence. But I know we had certain respondents say, I would love to, but I'm currently working for X studio or Y, and I just don't want to close that door. He's a very, very powerful man in Hollywood. Should we just go here first, just because we haven't had a question?
Sorry. It's on similar vein as that, but when you said, you talked about you wanted to redo it or cut it down, was that what you were saying you can't because then it's a different idea?
At the moment, my kind of interactive nerd geek girl dream is that we would allow the audience to kind of remix and demand their own version of the film, because there are particular geeks get very excited about certain things, certain points of debate. There are some members of the audience, for example, that wish we would have spent a lot longer talking about the new Indiana Jones film, or the one that he did, Crystal Skull. That's absolutely terrible. It made me cry a little bit, actually. That I got more upset. But anyway.
Made me cry inside.
But we have something like at least 50 hours of fan footage centering on that alone. Really? So, for example, I would love to have that on the website, whether paid or whether not paid, that audience members can play with and make their own mini documentary about Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull. However, just to make it narrower, in terms of the film itself, I would love people to remix it in the order and have the ending that they want. Some people think that we're too nice to George at the end, other people think we're not harsh enough. I would love them to remix it and in a kind of commercial way, buy it for £1.99 on iTunes, their version of the film. But because of all the fair use issues, we can't, because we would have to essentially then take out all of the Star Wars clips and all of there's a South Park clip, South Park's actually cleared. We cleared everything that we could, but essentially we would get into so much trouble that you would never return on investment, because there's just not the legal backing for it. You create a new version every time that's done.
That's where I was going to, because with under your fair use, did you have to establish the time of the length of your film off the top to say it's a 90-minute? You said it was 90 and 33, whatever. Like, if you had said off the top you were going to even create a 90-minute and a 60-minute, would you be able to get around that fair use idea that you've now created a different idea?
The principle of fair use is a well-established doctrine in copyright law, and what it says is, and USA is much wider as fair use. But the general principle is it is not copyright infringement to use copyright works or works covered by copyright if you use them for the purposes of criticism and review, and you use them fairly and only so much as is necessary for that purpose. So the key in something like this would be, am I using only so much as is necessary in order to make the point? And so if you are using, taking, say, for example, a scene from Star Wars, and the point you want to make is that actually Han Solo was originally a very different character because of whether he's shot first or not, and here's a scene that shows that he's actually a different character, then that's fair use, because you are using it for the purposes of criticism and review to illustrate a point. There is also under English law a principle that you can use third-party works for the purposes of reporting news and current events. And again, that's something that can be relied on. And so I think the key here, and the reason why lawyers would get themselves concerned over making all the content available, is it's all contextual. If that scene from Star Wars was not surrounded by narrative that criticises and reviews it and explains why it's there, then that's not necessarily fair use. What they would then do, the issue would be that by making that available for a third party to use, it could be looped and overdubbed with some music, and have somebody say, "This is what George Lucas didn't want you to see," or Han Solo, he's a badass. There's all sorts of stuff that could be done which would not fall in the category, and you've therefore enabled that to happen. As a lawyer, however, who loves solving these problems, I think there's a way in which you could achieve what you want to achieve, but you'd be sailing close to the wind. And there's also a thing under, certainly in the US law and European law, called the safe harbour principle, that means that if contributors, users, upload content to a website that you are hosting or a server that you are hosting, and you don't have any control over the selection of that content, it's just there for people to see, just like YouTube, then you only have a liability to remove that or to deal with that once you are put on notice and fail to act expeditiously to remove it. The difficulty here is that this stuff would not be stuff that that third parties would be posting. But what you could potentially do, and I should probably add a legal disclaimer to this, is allow them to repost that content and as part of a UGC platform. Now, you would probably get letters from LucasArts saying, remove this, remove this, remove this, but you might not. And in the meantime, people would have access to it just in the same way as YouTube does. But that's probably something that requires a little more careful consideration. But the point is, there are ways of achieving these objectives by looking at the rights, where the rights sit. And certainly what Anna's done that has been, in my view, genius, is establish a framework in which consumers or users can contribute content without having, and use that content without having a liability to those users, and without, and then use that content in a way that has allowed her to not have a liability to the original content owners. I think that's just great.
And yeah, I mean, just shortly, we have to wrap up in a minute. The other thing that we did that I didn't really talk about is we negotiated quite hard the rights with particularly our English language distributor. They don't have the rights to the 700 hours or to the 2 hours of interview we did with Gary Kurtz. They have the rights to the 90-minute film that they have bought. So that's why I think the door is still open for us to do something like that, because I do believe it has a life and it could just be really good and fun. And the more that I think we've made the film that we wanted to make, but the more that we can put that out there and hopefully kind of forge new ways of working in this sort of arena, the better. Really, and we can answer some questions afterwards as well.
We've been asked to wrap up, but I know you had a question. I don't know if
Can we do one very quick last question? Sorry.
It's Mark Ashmore from Future Artists. It was kind of answered there, if the users create the content, because you're effectively working with media creators who are all filmmakers and things like that. So if they create something and it goes outside your digital space, people that are watching those 60 minutes or whatever they've created, because they're probably going to rip it from your DVD anyway that they've purchased. But people will always go back to the source and see, well, where did this originally came from? Because obviously it's been remixed and it's available on this platform over here, but people will follow it because that's what they like to do. So you effectively monetize it that way by association, and you will get the cease and desist or whatever, but it was kind of explained there, and that's what I was thinking, is it becomes an advert in itself, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because you're working with media creators. Yeah. So.
And that's definitely true from the perspective. I think the point that when our DVD comes out, people are going to put that online. We've got a whole section about fan editors in the film. And so if they're going to do it, I would rather actually us give them everything and the kind of pure, sound feeds and everything to really play with than just to rip it.
That wasn't actually a question, was it? That's my question.
Absolutely. We can make that happen.
Find me safe harbour.
You have it here. I will give some pro bono advice to try and make this happen, so long as I get a credit.
Thank you, Question Man. Thanks for your time.